present research that seeks to explore how relict prehistoric and Roman features became embedded within the praxis of landscape use between the 5th and 9th centuries AD. I investigate why particular locations were chosen as places of funerary ritual, and how these choices were influenced by landscape character, the physical environment, and land use. I look at the significance of different categories of ancient monument to mortuary practices, and interrogate apparent patterns in monument reuse from place to place. I also examine how burial sites relate to and reveal early medieval patterns in movement through the landscape. Fundamentally, I consider how such processes of ordering, conceptualising, and exploiting the landscape for funerary practice relate to processes of identity and territory formation. So the research projects drawn upon and discussed today are twofold. I'll first talk about some aspects of the results and outcomes of PhD research undertaken at the University of Exeter and soon to be published that focuses on the area ultimately defined by the Kingdom of Wessex between 450 and 850 AD. And this built the ground for a new 3-year project funded by the British Academy. And this second body of research, which I want to introduce here, expands the geographical and chronological scope to incorporate both southeastern England and areas of France and the Low Countries between 400 and 900. So the reuse or recycling of prehistoric monuments in successive eras following their construction is a topic that's received much attention over the past few decades. It was perhaps unsurprisingly stimulated initially by prehistory. Richard Bradley's influential paper on Yevering in the late 80s brought to the fore the idea of intentional and calculated strategies of appropriation and manipulation of elements of the distantly removed past, affording them new layers of meaning, sometimes without any real awareness of their original purpose. Seminal studies on early medieval monument reuse by Howard Williams and Sarah Semple, and on regional patterns of burial and settlement by Sam Lucy and Stuart Brooks, for example, have revealed clear commonalities in terms of how populations responded to monuments across Britain and Ireland, a preference towards barrows, sites close to boundaries or routeways, and a trend towards isolated burial from the late 6th century. But they equally serve to convey the importance of specific context in illuminating subtleties and variations from place to place. There's now a substantial body of regionally focused studies on burial and landscape, which I hope to add to. And with my new project, I also intend to widen the scale of analysis with a view to improve our understanding of the processes taking place on a super-regional level, and to what extent elite groups throughout Northwest Europe shared a common mindset, adopting and controlling cultural indicators on a more expansive scale from around the 7th century. So through the Wessex project, a methodological framework was developed for interpreting the burial data. The aim was for an holistic exploration of the landscape context of funerary sites, not focusing solely on monument reuse, but integrating other aspects of the inhabited landscape. It involved creating a geo-reference data set of all known cemeteries and burial sites, rather than just cherry-picking key sites that are well known. So a total of 188 burial sites were compiled in the core Wessex counties of Wiltshire, Hampshire and Dorset. This empirical data gathering and analysis of geographical distribution is combined with detailed microtopographic studies of funerary locales, also drawing on place names and other sources. I investigate how these sites relate to physical aspects of the landscape, such as routeways, watercourses, boundaries, settlements, and earthworks. So one thing that was immediately apparent from the distribution was the striking relationship with geology. 78% of the sites are located on chalk geology, and despite the fact that this bedrock group only underlies less than half of the total land area. And if we take only those burial sites that directly reuse earlier features, an even higher proportion, 88%, are situated on chalk geology. While this apparent primacy of the chalklands in the mortuary topography of Wessex is partly reflects contemporary early medieval settlement patterns, the correlation is also heavily influenced by taphonomy and patterns of archaeological investigation. The density of upstanding prehistoric monuments on the chalk downlands of Wiltshire and Dorset attracted 18th and 19th century antiquarians, and intrusive early medieval burials were revealed through this highly targeted investigation method. Archaeological features also tend to be more visible, and human bone preservation is better on chalk soils. So over half the burial sites, 55%, were found to be directly associated, that is, graves cut into or within 50 metres of at least one discernible element of the prehistoric or Roman landscape. 67% were located within 300 metres of such a feature. And a wide range of features were appropriated. The key to it is to understand whether this was simply a case of using what was available, or whether certain monuments were consciously selected, perhaps because they served the particular needs of communities within the local area. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the most commonly reused category is funerary or ritual monuments. These include barrows, megaliths, prehistoric or Roman flat cemeteries, accounting for 49% of all features appropriated. These are the type of features that previous studies of monument reuse have tended to focus on. Yet it's also apparent that a variety of other types of monument were reused, including non-funerary earthworks and settlements, which account for nearly a third of the reused features. 12% are in the Roman buildings category, and a similar proportion fall within the routeways category. Barrows are still the single most commonly appropriated type of feature. And some interesting results are produced when we look at the distribution of the reuse of different types of barrow, notably in the county of Wiltshire. So although the classic bowl barrows, which have no separation between the mound and the ditch, are the most common barrow type in Wiltshire overall, more unusual types of barrow seem to have been preferentially chosen for the siting of early medieval burial sites. So does this mean that communities were drawn to barrows with unconventional morphologies, or did such barrows just happen to be in desirable locations? So there's some highly localised patterns of selection. On the left here we can see all excavated bell barrows, and in red all bell barrows that were found to be associated with 5th to 9th century burials. On the right we can see the same for long barrows. Those reused for early medieval burial tend to be grouped in particular geographical areas. Bell barrows were selected on the ridges above the river valleys in eastern Salisbury Plain, you can see on the southern side of that map, but were generally avoided on the Marlborough Downs to the north, and long barrows are preferentially reused in western Salisbury Plain. So I'm just going to discuss a few case studies. A key example of an unusual type of barrow being reused for an early medieval community cemetery is Barrow Clump on eastern Salisbury Plain. It's the top left red dot on the left map. More than 70 graves dating from the 6th century have been found to overlie a Bronze Age bell barrow in recent years. It's part of an extensive barrow cemetery, with Barrow Clump the only barrow still extant. It was close to an important Roman estate centre and nodal place, a function which perhaps continued into the post-Roman period. It may be significant that numerous items of Roman manufacture were recovered from the cemetery, including brooches and a pierced coin. In this valley, the Salisbury Avon Valley, could be considered the core area for the practice of communal secondary barrow burial in Wessex. This is predominantly in the 6th century. These cemeteries, such as the small group of richly furnished burials at Bremer in Hampshire, demonstrate far-reaching connections. They made use of imposing monuments in prominent places, adjacent to important exchange and communication routes. The Avon linked the Wessex heartland of the Upper Thames Valley with the Channel coast and the continent beyond. Through monumentality and funerary events, they were able to demonstrate their control over corridors of communication. So, moving to Western Wessex now. Not only cemeteries with culturally diagnostic Anglo-Saxon finds are associated with prehistoric monuments. Two unaccompanied west-east orientated burials at Highley Farm on the edge of Cranbourne Chase in Dorset produced an early 8th century date. By that time, the area was part of the Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of Wessex. So were grave goods simply no longer being deposited, or does it represent, as has been suggested, a post-Roman British population? But are these ethnic labels even relevant, or are they too prescriptive? Burials are often ambiguous and difficult to define in ethnic terms, in terms of cultural identity. Categorising a burial as Anglo-Saxon on the basis of a single artefact such as a knife, or British in the absence of grave goods, is problematic, and the situation is much more complex than a simple Saxon-British dichotomy. In Western Wessex, it could be argued that there was a partial adoption or selective incorporation of aspects of an Anglo-Saxon identity into a dominant indigenous culture. There seems to have been considerable mutual interaction between kin groups with different cultural and funerary traditions. So as these case studies illustrate, not only elite groups were appropriating earlier monuments, even later in the 7th century or 8th century, but what could be also termed as ordinary cemeteries, ordinary communities. The emergence of high-status isolated burial within earlier features is, though, a distinct and significant development. These burials are often in more elevated positions, occupying what was or what had been common pasture, and are associated with a period of agricultural intensification in the so-called long 8th century. Male burials of this type emerge in the early 7th century, while the female burials can now be dated to the mid to late 7th century. A well-known example of an isolated burial is Swallow Cliff in the South Wiltshire Downs. This isolated female bed burial lay within a Bronze Age barrow on a ridge top that forms a watershed, close to a trackway described in the 10th century as a herapath or military road, which followed the ridge. And the grave goods are suggestive of the influence of ecclesiastical agency as well as secular power. The burial is contemporary with a monastic boom during the reign of King Ina in the 7th century. This was a time when important and powerful women became more visible and have a voice within the written record. Although the individual buried at Swallow Cliff is unlikely to have been herself part of a religious community, Christian motifs were certainly drawn upon. So why was she not buried in a churchyard? It shows perhaps that there was a range of options available for members of elites. Moreover, they did not necessarily want to relinquish their old traditions, perhaps due to a belief similar to that alluded to in Irish law codes that the powerful dead continued to exert control over the land. All of the case studies I've discussed are situated adjacent to routeways, and these routes were certainly in existence by the post-medieval period, and some are mentioned in contemporary sources. I found that community cemeteries tend to be adjacent to routeways or droveways leading from the valley bottom to the higher downland. Isolated high-status burials like Swallow Cliff, on the other hand, tend to lie next to longer distance routes. More specifically, high-status female burials are often found adjacent to long-distance ridge-top droveways, while high-status male burial sites are found next to Roman roads, often in new barrows rather than inserted into prehistoric ones. So from this evidence, I would reassert what's now a fairly well-rehearsed argument that cemeteries were located so as to emphasise rights to land and resources. Pasture was a vital part of the economy, and there was little change in this regard between the 5th and 7th centuries, as can be seen from environmental evidence. Pastoralism and transhumance were important in the establishment of early folk territories based in river valleys and divided by watersheds, and for the maintenance of a communal identity, as work by Sue has shown. Communities placed cemeteries alongside short-distance droveways leading up onto the downland pasture, perhaps to emphasise a symbolic claim over it. These routes often provided the obvious boundaries for estates and land units formalised in the Middle to Late Saxon period. So to briefly summarise some of the findings from Wessex in relation to spatial positioning and territoriality, which is what I've focused on today, monuments were used to differentiate between social territories and landscape zones. New burials emphasised and reinforced these boundaries. Funerary sites adjacent to short-distance valley-side droveways allowed communities to legitimise rights to pasture and cultivation. This was a tradition established early on in the 5th and 6th centuries. High-status isolated burials from the late 6th and 7th century, placed adjacent to long-distance routeways, can be seen as the adaptation of this existing vernacular tradition. They're used to maintain and emphasise control of land, and in some cases perhaps as attempts to elevate individuals to cult status. So it's now clear that a Europe-wide phenomenon of renewed investment in funerary monumentality is at play during the post-Roman period. Populations in disparate areas of the continent were drawing on a similar repertoire for forging distinct identities based on shared origin myths, material culture sets, and assembly practices. but each in slightly different ways. The reuse of Roman villas for burial in Merovingian Francia, for example, played a crucial role in defining and legitimising present status and future aspirations, as the work of Bonnie Efros and Guy Halsel's discussed. Although an important mosaic of regional studies has been amassed, scholarly exchange across national borders, particularly with respect to Anglo-Saxon and Merovingian funerary archaeology, has been limited, whether due to language barriers or traditionally regional or national agendas. There's also been a tendency for Anglo-Saxonists to look to Scandinavia for parallels and stimuli, rather than our nearest continental neighbours in France and the Low Countries. Studies on settlement archaeology and material culture have demonstrated the value of a comparative Northwest European approach. Extensive artefactual evidence for cross-channel contact and interaction has now been identified. Yet while possible influences in terms of the funerary landscape have been noted, these have yet to be fully investigated. Very little has been done on prehistoric reuse in France in particular, but tantalising examples are beginning to emerge. And in Flanders too, several cemeteries published in recent years appear to reuse prehistoric barrows in strikingly similar ways to in England. Beerse Krommenhof and other sites in Campina, and also in the south and west of the region. So my study area incorporates the counties of Kent, Sussex, Surrey, Hampshire and the Isle of Wight in southern England, and in France, Normandy and Hauts-de-France, what was Picardy and Nord-Pas-de-Calais, and Flanders in Belgium and Zeeland in the Netherlands. So the initial objective is to build a database of all 5th to 9th century burial sites and their landscape context. So what are the big questions and what can be gained? So I hope to identify trends, evidence for mutual interaction and deliberate differentiation, to investigate the emergence or re-emergence of distinctive practices such as barrow burial, and to look at how symbolically charged monuments and natural features became part of popular beliefs and folklore. I fundamentally aim to provide new perspectives on trans-European activity and processes of kingdom and identity formation. By integrating Anglophone and non-Anglophone material, I hope to bring together conceptually the English Channel and North Sea zone. In the current geopolitical climate, it's more important than ever to contextualise Britain and Europe.